From the United Nations Office to the African Union, this is She Stands for Peace. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, and in this podcast, I speak with thought leaders and peace builders who share their reflections and best practices towards achieving objectives of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in Africa. In this episode, Rita Lopidia, Executive Director and co-founder of EVE Organization for Women Development in Juba, South Sudan, and coordinator of the South Sudan Women's Coalition for Peace, joins me from Kampala, and we have a conversation about violence against women peace builders. Ms. Rita Lopidia, it's a pleasure to speak with you today. Your organization, EVE, was established to help improve women's participation in peace processes in South Sudan. And you've also led a coalition of over 50 women's civic groups. So how would you describe the work you do as a woman peace builder, and what does it mean for you to be a woman peace builder?
Thank you, Amy, for the opportunity. As a women's organization, of course, our mandate as EVE organization is to open up space for women's participation and ensure women take part in the reconstruction and building of a developed state in South Sudan. And we believe that women should be central in processes such as peace building and nation building processes. So in terms of the role of women as peace builders, I see two important things. One, first of all, before talking about the women's side, we talk about peace, because peace is the interest of everybody. And our major role is to ensure that the community we live in, the country we live in, is peaceful. That's why, as a woman peace builder, we think it is important to be part of peace building. The second aspect of the role of a woman's peace builder is to ensure that in the process of making peace, that there are special needs, there are special requests that women want to see reflected. For instance, to ensure that there is a sustainable peace, the peace process itself have to be inclusive. So the role of a woman peace builder first is to ensure that they contribute to peace and to ensure that the peace is inclusive, including what women need to see. And something else that I will add is that women get affected by conflict in different ways. For instance, in peace negotiation, people always, most of the time, focus around the issue of power sharing. But for us as women, we want to ensure that there are other key things that are involved. For instance, when it comes to humanitarian access, opening of corridors to ensure that women get the services they need. And in terms of protection, to ensure that during conflicts, and in the process of peace building, that issues of protections, issues of bringing perpetrators to books have to be included. And these are some of the key things that women bring about when they come to peace processes.
Okay, so no doubt you have firsthand firsthand the experiences and challenges that women peace builders face in this pursuit of peace and all the areas of work that you've laid out for us. But because despite instruments like the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, which provides for their support and protection, women's peace builders face intersecting forms of violence that can be both physical and non-physical. And according to the UN, in 2020, there were 35 assassinations of human rights defenders, journalists, trade unionists, etc., documented in 26 conflict-affected countries around the world. So, in your years of experience as a woman peace builder in South Sudan, have you faced violence because of your work? And if yes, what kind of violence do women peace builders like yourself tend to experience?
In the case of South Sudan, yes, women peace builders, me inclusive, we have faced a number of challenges, I would say. And among them is the psychological violence, words that are thrown at women, words that are used to threaten women. For instance, in the peace process, this word of women peace builders being seen as spies for the West is commonly thrown at us. We are also seen as selling out the country. Meanwhile, all that we are sharing, all that we are bringing to the table is actually the concerns that are happening on the ground. So this violence actually affects because the threats is about threats on your life, threats on your families, threats on your organization. Some of us almost got our organization's registration revoked, being questioned by security. You know, the aspects that the national security will pick you from your office and take you to their office for interrogation. It is a sort of violence itself because the amount of fear you go through and the psychological impact on that you go through amounts to serious violence. And this is what women peace builders in South Sudan continuously go through. I would say in our context, we have not heard yet of physical violence on women peace builders, but the psychological, the threats are there. And this is faced among so many women peace builders, not only in South Sudan, but we also heard of similar stories elsewhere. Yes, personally, I have been one of the minds behind the women's participation in the revitalization process. And that is a result of me not being in the country, first of all. Because when the country went into violence, back to violence in 2016, I was actually out of the country, not because of my own will, but because I was forced to, because of activism. But then being out of the country and being in the region, I still felt, even if I'm not in the country, I can still raise the voices of women. And thanks to the neighboring countries that gave me the platform to be able to raise my voice and try to bring women together. So I was in exile in Uganda. And while in Uganda, I was able to reach out to a number of people, including the IGAD. And through them, we were able to bring a number of women from the refugee camp from within South Sudan and other neighboring countries together in Entebbe to discuss what we can do to stop the violence in South Sudan. And as a result of bringing these women out of the country, including those in the refugee camps, were able to agree to be united and form a loose coalition to head to Addis Ababa for the peace process. Initially, I was invited as an individual to be part or to be a delegate to the peace process. But being there before, I know for sure numbers matters. And that was the reason I decided that my voice alone won't be enough, but let us bring women together and try to push for more women's participation. So, based on that, we were able to go to Addis and we were able to advocate and lobby the African Union. We lobby the other missions, for instance, the Troika and the IGAD countries to reconsider having more women in the peace process. And that resulted to more 4 delegates for the Women's Coalition to be at the peace table. And through that, the space started opening up for other women. Because what we did when we got in is in every opening statement we have, we always ensure that we call out the parties that didn't have women. And we have seen that through that and with our continuous advocacy, other parties started bringing in women. And that way, in the second and third rounds of the negotiation, we saw a number of more women joining in the peace process. But there were a lot of other things that women did. One, we kept on talking to the parties. There were instances where there is the peace process just stranded. Um, uh, Parties are not talking to each other. So we would go to the different parties and talk to them. And we would send some delegates also to talk to them. And that help the parties to come back to the peace table. And there were instances where we also advise the mediators on the approaches they take. Because speaking to the parties, for instance, before the cessation of hostility agreement would be signed, there was a particular party that walked out and said that they are not going to sign because the approach the mediators were taking they're not happy with it. So some of us took that and met with the mediators and talked to them and asked them to go back and talk to these parties. And eventually, the cessation of hostility agreement was signed. So we played this role of mediating between the parties and also advising. I would say it's an sort of advisory role also to the mediators on how they can reach out to parties and talk to them. But secondly, when the peace process also moved to Khartoum, there were tension between the parties, and the environment where we were in was tense. It was the women that all came together and issued a statement that the threats and the insecurity that the parties were feeling and the threats around them should be stopped for the peace process to go on. And I think our statement also played a role to calm down, the whole atmosphere that was tense. And we did a lot of advocacy around that process also. For instance, calling on the parties to release Riek Machar on IGAD particularly, we advocated that he should be released from South Africa to come and take part in the peace process. It was the women that that are the first to raise this issue, and then it was taken over by Ethiopia and others, and eventually Riek Machar was able to come to Addis to be part of the peace process. And we also called for the inclusion of the position of a VP for a woman. And eventually it got into the agreement. So I would say women's participation brought a number of things. Even when you look into the peace agreement, there are a lot of articles that speak to women. For instance, I will, in chapter 2 and chapter 5 of the agreement, chapter 2, which is the transitional security arrangement, and chapter 5, that is the transitional justice, women called for the demilitarization of civilian centers, which was included, and the protection of the needs of women and girls and those other groups with special needs. We also called for the prohibition of sexual and gender based violence and exploitation during the conflict, and called for the protection of human rights of civilians to ensure safety and dignity of individuals and communities during the conflict. Then in chapter 5, there is an article that is included in the agreement that calls for the trial of any cases of sexual and gender-based violence. And there are also a number of peace implementation mechanisms that included women. For instance, the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission for the Peace Process, the Citizen Board, which is the ceasefire and transitional security arrangement monitoring and verification mechanism. There are also women who sit in that board. in that board, and the Strategic Defense and Security Review Board also have a number of women representation. But also in the power sharing, there are a number of women, apart from the 35% women's representation, the position of the VP was created, and the gender and youth cluster was also created, and the Women Enterprise Fund. So, a number of articles actually that support women issues are included in the agreement.
And that's all great, but the implementation of the agreement has been slow. So, you've outlined there very comprehensively all the ways in which the agreement provides for women. But what, in your opinion, has been the realities of women's participation and inclusion in the implementation and in achieving all of these provisions in the agreement for women?
Um, Yemi, when it comes to peace implementation, unfortunately, the political parties are seen as the signatories to the agreement. And when it comes to the implementation of any peace agreement, it is the parties that are on the forefront, and they are the ones that takes decision. So, as women activists, it has always been a challenge to us to keep on calling out the political parties to implement the peace agreement in letter and spirit. And I will tell you honestly, it is an uphill task. It is not easy because, first of all, including the women in the political parties, the allegiance first is to the parties, then to the women's movement. So we always face this challenge that, yes, there is poor, I would say, lack of political will to really implement the peace agreement in the pace that it's supposed to take. And it has been slugging from day one. And the role of women is to continue calling and urging parties to commit to what they have signed. But honestly, apart from that, it's very difficult because we are not the direct implementers of the peace. And that is one of the main challenges that, as women peace advocates, we always discuss this point, and it is just difficult to find a clear answer on how we can get parties to really implement what they say they can.
Mm, mm. And speaking about your work and the extent to which you can participate, funding for women peace building organizations like Eve really does ensure that you can maximize your potentials and impact that you can have in these processes. But most women peace builders either work voluntarily or informally, and this further exposes them to various forms of violence and reprisals, and also restrictions in terms of involvement in the formal processes. But the funding channels can also be problematic, given that donors often channel their financial support through big international organizations like the UN. And if we're still complaining about the lack of inclusion of women in formal peace processes, and that women peace builders still work informally, we can see how access to funding can also play a big role to this. So, and in the 2019 Women, Peace and Security report by the Secretary General himself, he stated that only 0.2% of bilateral aid to fragile and conflict affected situations from 2016-2017 was provided directly to women's organizations. So, as a women peace building organization, what are your reflections on this, and how would you like to see access to funding change, especially when we consider the protection, the support that women peace builders need, and then some of the things you said about the extent to which you can even participate in implementation?
Funding is always an issue when it comes to women's organizations in general. And we have always struggled to get funding. And as you've rightly said, most of this funding comes through other organizations. and we are seen as subcontractors or sub recipient of these funds. And these funds comes after a long list of requirements for you to qualify for these funds. And honestly, most women organizations cannot meet some of these requirements. For instance, asking for the audit report for 3 to 4 years. Some of these organizations are small, and they might not have all, or they might not even have funding to audit their work. So some of these requirements immediately right from the start disqualify a number of women's organizations. And also some of the funding are strictly for certain objectives. There are only a few donors that will have flexible funding for women. For instance, for us to be able to move from point A to point B to take part in the peace process, only a few partners were open to support us. But most of the funding are also rigid, you know. And sometimes you will see a call that is put out, for instance, for 250,000 with all this long list of requirements. And after applying, then they will tell you we only have 50,000. For crying out loud, why would you put a call for that amount and then after that you'll tell me we only have 50,000 for you? So these are some of the challenges that women's organization face. Even during this implementation of the peace agreement, there are a number of things that we are not able to advocate or run around to push because we don't have money, you know. And there are certain sensitive meetings that we still cannot also do in country that you want to step out to be able to discuss in a free environment, but you don't get funding for that. So women face a lot of challenges around funding. And another important point, apart from project implementation, you know, the security of women, the protection of these women advocates. When anything's happened to you, who will take responsibility? It's very difficult. I have been out of the country for almost 4 years, but I have to support myself alone. I have reached out to a number of organizations, and they will tell me, since you are already out of the country, we cannot support you. So there is no flexible funding to protect women that find themselves in situation like mine. And there are a number of other activists that are going through the same. And the other aspect, you know, when it comes to donor funding, they will only give you, for instance, 20% to cater for your staffing, to cater for administrative costs, which is little. And you end up not having money for, say, health insurance. And in the course of what we do, earlier on, we talked about the trauma and the psychological violence that women go through. And this affects the health of women peace builders, the mental health of women peace builders. So when you fall sick, you don't have any support for your healing process. This is also not considered as part of protection of women peace builders. So I think when it comes to funding, I think there is a need of a serious discussion on how women who are peace builders in areas of conflict need to be viewed, need to be supported, particularly when it comes to their personal protection and mental health.
So it's interesting you talk there about how women peace builders are perceived, because there are some questions also on how attentive policy actors and mechanisms are in considering the gender context of women peace builders in the line of work. So including how disempowering the language and the rhetoric used sometimes in official content to talk about women, peace, and security agenda in terms of the role and work of women peace builders can be. So, what are your reflections on this? And do you think the language used officially to talk about women peace builders is helpful in terms of representation and how communities in conflict perceive them? Or would you like to see the rhetoric reconsidered?
For me, what is important is walking the talk. You can have all the rhetoric, you can have all the official language and bring out the best words you have for the policymakers, for those who sit up there to decide or to bring up policies for women. But if it doesn't address the reality on the ground, then we are missing out the point. So, does this language really address the reality on the ground, or we are just using it at that level when we present speeches to ensure that people understand that you speak this language, so these keywords you have to utter them, but does it reflect the reality on the ground? Is what I am concerned about as an activist. So, we need to reflect the official language to address the reality on the ground. And if it doesn't address the reality on the ground, that then probably we need to start thinking whether it is actually effective.
Thank you so much, Rita Lopidia, for speaking with me today. Today, we've talked about the backlash to various forms of violence, both physical and non physical, that women peace builders face in the line of work and the kind of support that you would like to see. So, to finish off our conversation, if there was one action you would like our listeners to take today in relation to all that we've discussed, what would that be?
I would say we need to listen to women peace builders. And when I say listen, it's not just our advocacy. Listen to what we are not saying. Listen to when we cry out for protection. Listen when our mental health are challenged. Because if we are not fit, because if we are not protected, we will not be able to continue in the work that we are doing.
Thank you very much, Rita. Thank you for listening to She Stands for Peace, the podcast series where thought leaders and peace builders share their reflections and best practices in the women, peace, and security agenda in Africa. I am Dr. Yemsi Akimbobola, and this podcast was produced by the United Nations Office to the African Union with the generous support of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Don't forget to join the conversation using the hashtag She Stands for Peace.